Thank you very much, and thank you very much also to Gabrielle for inviting me here to this conference. I'm very, very nervous because I don't normally talk to audiences like this. I normally talk to audiences of development researchers who want to do their work in a way which will increase their impact on policy and practice. So there's a lot of argument about approaches, but actually to talk to an audience who have been looking specifically at how you do that is quite nerve-wracking, but also very exciting, because I think, as Gabrielle said earlier on, there's a real opportunity to come up with ways of doing science which can be more useful for society. And the first thing I did when I started putting this presentation together was change the title. The title was Knowledge versus Politics, How Research Can Contribute to Better Policy. Now that is fantastically, if not impossible, to measure. And what we do in the Overseas Development Institute in the RAPID programme is look at how research can contribute better to policy. We believe that policies which are better informed by research-based evidence will be better policies. We're doing some work now on impact evaluation which will enable us to test that. But for the sake of this talk, I'm going to focus on how research can contribute better to policy. And both Gabrielle and Gerald have talked a lot about wicked problems, so I don't need to talk about them. These are the sorts of problems which we're trying to deal with, complex, multifactorial, etc. I also don't want to talk about that, but I do want to say that I'm not at all saying that traditional disciplinary science is no longer necessary. It is enormously valuable, and this is just a picture of a trial plot of IR36 rice, which was the rice variety. It took 15 years to develop, but it transformed food production and economic growth in the whole of Asia. So traditional disciplinary research is fantastically important, but what we need to do is some research in a way which is better integrated with policy and current world problems. And that's what we do in the RAPID programme in the Overseas Development Institute. We look at how research-based evidence gets into policy and practice, and we look at three broad areas. One is about, we call it power, politics and evidence use. Another is about evidence production and communication. And the third we call knowledge intermediaries and interactions, which is how that research-based evidence gets into policy and practice. And we tend to work in the middle of this kind of area, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. And we do a whole range of work, research work, advisory work, a lot of communications and public affairs work, and also quite a lot of capacity development work for the different actors who are involved in this process. And we've come up with a very simple concept that there are 6 lessons about why it is difficult for research-based evidence to influence policy and practice. Hugely oversimplistic, but I'm going to go through them 1 to 6 in case you're wondering what the numbers are at the top of the pages. So the first one is that policy processes are complex. They're not at all. This is the linear, logical model of policy process. This doesn't happen anywhere in the world, ever, I don't think. This is much more common. And much more scary. And we tend to call that policy-based evidence making. And there's a lot of that goes on. And also there's no sort of generally accepted model of policy process, but it's kind of a bit like this. It's a kind of a cycle type thing: formulation, decision making, implementation, monitoring, evaluation and agenda setting, and some of them all happen simultaneously and some of them don't happen at all. Woeful lack of monitoring and evaluation in most policy processes, but it's kind of a bit like this. And there are a lot of different actors involved in this process, and clearly some actors have a legitimate role at all stages in the cycle. Maybe the Cabinet should focus much more at the top end, but anyway, everybody on the policy-making side is involved in all of these, and so are all the other actors in the process. And looking at international development in particular, what's happening nowadays is that the development donors are increasingly trying to influence not only the process itself, but also all the other actors in the process. So the line agencies in developing countries are getting their own back. And very soon, everybody's trying to influence everybody, and it is fantastically complex. In fact, some people talk about it being chaotic, and this is a quote from Clay and Schaefer in 1984 in a book about agriculture and rural development policy. The whole life of policy, a chaos of purposes and accidents, not at all a matter of rational implementation of so-called decisions through selected strategies. We tend not to use the chaos word. We find chaos is a word which policymakers really don't like at all. And if you start talking about chaotic policy processes, you get nowhere fantastically slowly. So what we talk about now is complex, multifactorial and non-linear. And that's just fine. So anyway, So that's what we're looking at, complex, multifactorial, non-linear policy processes. If you want to engage with these, you really need to understand them. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two is that research-based evidence often plays a very small role in these processes. And if you could read the blogs, which I don't suggest you try and do, you'd see that two of them are immediately researchable questions. This is looking at policies and programs to reduce chronic poverty in Uganda, a whole raft of other issues, long-term issues, political issues, social issues, cultural issues, which affect whether or not policies and programs are going to be implemented to try and reduce chronic poverty. And if you want to read more about that, you can read that in the paper. So research-based evidence often plays a very minor role in most policy processes. And the third thing is that policymakers are practically incapable of using scientific evidence. And this is Vincent Cable, currently Secretary of State for Business and Innovation and Skills in the UK. And his 5 S's were speed. Legislators have to make decisions relatively quickly. They're covering a very wide territory, particularly if you're in opposition, which he was when he gave this talk at the Overseas Development Institute. By spin, he meant not the pejorative use of it. What he meant was you can't change your mind every 5 minutes. You have to kind of come up with a position and stick to it for a reasonable length of time. Secrecy, if you are in government, a lot of thinking about policy changes takes place in secret, as did a lot of the thinking in the Conservative Party about the way they were going to destroy the health service when they got into power. And the killer one, scientific ignorance. Meant very few legislators actually understand the principle of testing a hypothesis. This is why legislators, in particular, he's talking about legislators, find it very difficult to make use of research-based evidence. He also, Phil Davis, who was one of the architects of evidence-based policy in the UK, came up with this picture, which you may have seen before. It's become known as the daisy head picture, which is all the different sorts of things which policymakers have to take into account when they're making decisions. So scientific evidence is one of them, but their own experience and expertise, their own judgment, the resources available, values, habits, the activities of lobbyists and pressure groups, and simple pragmatics and contingencies. They have to balance a whole range of different forms of evidence, of which scientific research-based evidence is just one of them. He also came up with this slide, which I don't really need to talk about much. Gabrielle's talked about this, that researchers and policymakers have different perspectives. Researchers will only consider something legitimate if it's scientific, if it's context-free, if it's theoretically driven, whereas policymakers actually want solutions to real-world problems. They'll take more or less anything, so long as they get it at the right sort of time, and it helps them to make a decision. So that's the second lesson. The third lesson is don't despair. Research can have a huge impact, and this is one project we quote a lot, the Tanzania Integrated Health Improvement Project, where some sensible research done sensibly, basically what they did was they looked at the national healthcare programme, which assumed a certain disease prevalence. They looked at the disease prevalence in the 2 districts they were working in, and they found they were different. They realigned health services to align with the prevalence of diseases, and they achieved a huge reduction in infant mortality very quickly. So the right kind of research done in the right way can be hugely influential. The fourth lesson is that you need to take a holistic approach. You really need to understand the whole of the context you're working in if you want to try and engage with that process. And I was very much taken with Gerald's soft systems methodology. Step 1 is to map the mess. You really need to understand the situation. And we've come up with this framework with 4 dimensions. There are things that happen outside the context you're working in which affect what happens in the context. There are things about the politics, policy processes, the incentives facing various actors in that process we call the political context. There are factors around the evidence, the degree it challenges received wisdom or policy narratives, the way it's communicated, how credible it is, and there are factors around the way in which that research-based evidence gets into policy process. And I'll be talking a little bit more about this after lunch. And we like it because it maps onto real-life processes, so politics and policy making, research learning and thinking, and even the intersections between these map onto real-life things. So the intersection between politics and policy making, research learning and thinking is policy analysis and research, and many government departments have a policy analysis unit. So it's maps onto real-world things, and what we have found from about 100 case studies we've done around the world, of where research does or doesn't influence policy is when people are working in the middle of all of this that you get the best link between research and policy. It's when researchers are talking a lot to policymakers to understand the problems they're struggling with, are talking a lot with policymakers about the sorts of questions they would like answers to and about the ways of finding answers to those questions, are working very closely with other researchers and other stakeholders who are interested in this policy issue. And it's in that kind of context where you get the best uptake of research-based evidence into policy and practice. Hence the red dot. The implications of that are that if you want to be a researcher who engages successfully with policy processes, you need to be more than just a researcher. This is Amartya Sen, one of the world's most respected living development economists. So you clearly need to be a good researcher. Your evidence needs to be research-based. But you also need to be a good storyteller. Policymakers don't have time for thick research reports. They want a nice, coherent, simple story that they can understand. And this, in case you're wondering, is Scheherazade saving her life yet again by telling the Sultan a story so he didn't cut off her head in the morning. You also need to be a very good networker. That's already been discussed. You need to be a good engineer, and this is Isambard Kingdom Brunel, one of Britain's possibly finest engineers. And by engineer, what we mean is you need to be looking at the policy horizon, what's likely to be coming up in the future, starting to do research on that so that when there is an opportunity to engage with a policy, you actually have some evidence to describe. And you need to be a bit of a political fixer. This is Rasputin. You don't need to be quite as much of a fixer as he was, but you need to understand who makes the decisions and you need to be able to get to them. So you need a wide range of skills. And what we're not saying is that every single individual involved in this business needs to have all of these skills. But you need to put yourself together in groups with people and organisations who have these skills so that you can apply a more holistic approach. And the sixth lesson is that you need to do things differently. You need to focus much more on policy, probably establish different incentives. And one of the big problems in academia is that all the incentives are towards peer-reviewed publications, which have very little impact on policy practice. You probably need to establish different systems in your organisation. You probably need to spend much more on communications. You need to engage with different actors, produce different products, and be ready to seize unexpected policy opportunities and move very fast. So if you want to engage with policy in practice, you probably need to do things slightly differently. And what we've come up in RAPID is an approach to trying to do that. Also, a six-step approach. We obviously like the word six. You need to map the political context, identify the stakeholders, identify the way in which those stakeholders' behaviour needs to change if there is going to be a change in policy and practice, develop a strategy to achieve that change, figure out whether you've got the capacity to do it, and then establish monitoring and learning frameworks to do it. And this isn't a static process. This is a process which iterates throughout the whole course of the research. As you go through the research cycle, so very early on you need to do the initial research, then maybe identify interesting case studies, collaborative research with local researchers. And it's only as the research process matures that you may need or may have enough evidence to engage with key policy actors, identify the policy messages, and then also help implement change. So it's an iterative process. You go round and round. It's actually very similar to the Deming cycle, which you may know about: plan, do, check, act, but applied to using research-based evidence. And there's a whole raft of tools that you can use for this, very few of them developed by ourselves. I'm going to be talking much more about this after lunch, and there's also a brochure which explains much more about that. So the kind of approach that we're talking about, we think, is an approach, we actually think is a transdisciplinary approach. I mean, we're practitioners, we're not academics. I didn't realise until very recently that there is a whole lot of thinking going on about what is the difference between interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. We kind of just do it. We have a very simple model of transdisciplinarity. You've got disciplinary science, multidisciplinary science, interdisciplinary science, which is scientists collaborating together to address problems. And transdisciplinary science is just interdisciplinary science, but working with all the other stakeholders involved in the process. So it really is engaging non-scientists in the process of finding solutions to problems. Ooh, the numbers have just turned red. This is very scary. So I'm just going to spend the last few minutes giving some examples of projects we're involved in which are trying to do this. One I'm going to talk about has a rather strange title. I didn't come up with the title. Earthquakes Without Frontiers. This is a explicitly transdisciplinary project funded by Research Councils UK. This is a serious research funding organisation which insisted that this project should take a transdisciplinary approach, and that's evidence, I think, that the research funding community is starting to look at this approach more seriously. And it was trying to get a comprehensive knowledge of the hazards and their context, so the natural science and the social science, come up with appropriate and effective pathways to resilience, and to build a global partnership of organisations that can help. And the project's working in 3 different countries, China, Kazakhstan and Nepal, working on the ground with social scientists and natural scientists. I know most about China. In China, there's been some work doing mapping faults. There's been some work learning from the experience of the 2005 Sichuan earthquake, looking at the social factors which governed the response to that earthquake, visits and meetings in Xi'an, which is the centre of that area, meetings in Beijing, an establishment of a team and a country coordinator. And what's going to happen? Well, we need a local person who can really integrate this whole thing. Going to look at the response to the very recent earthquake, write shops, stakeholder meetings, and possibly the establishment of a transdisciplinary earthquake resilience research centre in Xi'an province. So that's trying to put this transdisciplinary approach into practice. And in the last 3 minutes and 9 seconds, I'm going to tell you about the most exciting project in the world working on this at the moment. This is a project that's funded by AusAid. It's called the Indonesian Knowledge Sector Initiative, and it is trying to ensure that Indonesia has the capacity to develop effective and socially accountable policies that meet priority development needs, and that Indonesia's knowledge sector produces, and we've actually inserted 2 words in there, and uses evidence to inform priority development policies. This is a 15-year programme. It's $500 million Australian dollars. This is serious money over a sensible period of time to try and achieve this. It's working on 4 different components on the supply side. So how can research organisations in Indonesia provide research-based evidence which is more useful to and is more used by policymakers on the demand side? How can policymakers be encouraged to make more use of research-based evidence with the various intermediary groups that are involved in the translation process? Of course, many of the supply side people are engaged very closely with policymakers, and the demand side people are engaged very closely with researchers. So a lot of the intermediary work actually is performed by researchers or policymakers. But there are other intermediary groups that are very important, like civil society organisations and the media, etc., that can help to translate research-based evidence into policy. And importantly, to work on the enabling environment. So that's the whole complex of laws and traditions which limit the use of research-based evidence. And just, it's 5 years, 15 years, 3 5-year phases. The first year is basically learning about the situation. The second year is coming up with approaches to improve these situations. And the third phase is trying to embed this within the whole culture and legislative framework which governs the knowledge sector in Indonesia. It is the most exciting project in the knowledge sector in the world today. And it's just starting. If you want to know more about that, you can look it up online. And if you want to know more about any of this stuff, there's a whole lot of stuff on our website. I've already shown you. This is a briefing paper which talks much more about the analytical framework, which I showed right at the beginning. I'll talk a bit more about this at lunchtime. This is the briefing paper which talks about the 6 lessons and the 6 steps. And then there's a whole raft of toolkits of different types. If you're interested from any part of the spectrum who are involved in this, if you're a researcher trying to communicate better, we have communication tools. If you're a policymaker trying to make better use of research-based evidence, there's a whole raft of tools. We have a toolkit called Tools for Progressive Policymakers about how policymakers can make better use of research-based evidence. 17 seconds, and that's it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, John, for another fantastic foundational contribution to the discussion over the next 3 days. So again, a few minutes for questions and discussion to build the conversation over the meeting.
Hello, my name is Becky Schmidt from CSIRO here in Canberra. I was wondering if you could expand on your concept of a write shop of existing knowledge, of gathering existing knowledge.
Okay, I came across the term right shop about, I guess, 10 years ago, developed by IRI, the International Rice Research Institute, just as a mechanism of bringing together a wide range of stakeholders. Well, I think initially primarily kind of researchers and agricultural extension agents and policymakers into a week-long event with a specific objective of actually producing a sort of guideline or a handbook at the end. So you kind of get people to think about, you know, you identify the topics beforehand, you identify topic authors, and to start to think about the sort of framework of the thing. And then you bring this group together and you sort of lock the door and they don't leave until they've produced the book. And you have also editors and production-related people who can actually, you know, package it all up and edit it, so that at the end of the workshop you've actually got a product. Because the trouble is, after many workshops, and I think it'll be different with this workshop, but if the knowledge isn't gathered, first of all, gathered together in one place so that people can access it, and processed to a certain degree, the value of that individual event dissipates very quickly, which is why you see so much sort of reinvention of the wheel going on.
Thank you. Question here. Thank you.
Hi, Rochelle Christian, Australian Government Department of Innovation. I wanted to pick up on your comment about the need for different incentives to encourage researchers to engage in policy problems, and I wondered if you had some solutions or suggestions about what kind of incentives might be needed.
Well, I'll talk about two different things. One is, and you may or may not know about this, and one of the speakers right at the beginning of the day mentioned this. In the UK, they've just introduced a new way of assessing the effectiveness of universities. Previously, they had I think it was a 3-yearly process called the Research Assessment Exercise, which judged the quality of the research products used by the university, and the results of that exercise determined how much money the university's got to do research with. And what they're doing now, they've replaced it with a new thing called the Research Effectiveness Framework, which still does that by and large. 80% of the energy is focused on that, but 20% of the assessment is focused specifically on evidence of research uptake. And as the speaker earlier on this morning said, universities have to produce case studies which illustrate how their research has been useful. So I think in the UK, in academia, the incentives are starting to shift slightly, and the universities are now investing much more money in that kind of stuff and recognising that academics need to be involved in that kind of stuff in order to do well in the ref. The other example I give is ODI. We're supposed to be a think tank. We're supposed to be engaging with policy issues. That's what we do our research for. We're also entirely self-funded. We make our living through the contracts we get. And frankly, the thing that I wake up in the night and panic about is whether I'm going to meet my income target rather than whether I'm going to actually influence policy in practice. So even in ODI, which calls itself a think tank, we don't have quite the right incentive structures to get the right kinds of behaviours of the people involved in the work.
Question over here.
I should just say it's changing over the last couple of years, and the new director is addressing this in case I get picked up on it when I get back home.
Question up.
Jenny Stewart, UNSW Canberra. John, your techniques work well in the aid context. Do they transfer to the developed country context?
Well, I think so. I mean, we've based quite a lot of our work on what's been happening, particularly in the UK, and people like Sandra Nutley is one of the sort of inspirations for our work, and many of the innovations, particularly on the policy side, were driven by people involved in this sort of early work on evidence-based policy in the UK. So a lot of the lessons, I think, are visible there. I do think that international development is an environment which is much more suited to this kind of approach than more traditionally established academic, well, policy and academic environments in developed countries, where you have much more entrenched views on both sides. And I think international development is an area where there is debate actually about whether there should be a discipline which is about international development. So it's not confined within disciplinary boundaries, and also the policy and the research community actually work together very closely all the time anyway. So it's a relatively easy environment to do this stuff in, but I think the approaches are relevant everywhere.
Question in the middle here.
Mark Edwards from University of Western Australia. I just want to ask about this shift in focus. You went from policy contributing to better, research contributing to better policy, to research better contributing better to policy. And the political or ideological use of research to I guess, justify existing sort of ideological policies or ideological positions which are enacted in government policies. Could you say something around those sorts of issues?
Well, how to avoid being conscripted into policy-based evidence making? Is that what you're talking about? It's very difficult, particularly if you're in an environment where you have to earn your keep. And I'll just give some examples from what we do in ODI to try and make sure that that doesn't happen. We insist, for example, on the right to publish all of our work. So that discourages donors from funding us who have a particular end product or a particular conclusion in mind. It discourages them from funding us. We have a board and an external advisory committee which judges the quality of our work. And we have sort of various internal mechanisms to try and make sure that we don't take on contracts where there is a policy objective in mind. So there are various mechanisms you can put in place in organisations like ODI to try and avoid being captured by policymakers, but it is quite tricky.
Okay, thank you. Very last question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a great presentation. Jane Holloway from the Department of Defence. I had a similar question to Jenny Stewart's, but not the developing world divide, but rather in a domain sense. And a lot of these examples come from agriculture, health, youth work, drugs. How do you see those mapping into some other policy areas like defence and national security and water reform, financial regulation, fields like that? Thank you.
I mean, I think the principles are sound across the board, really. I mean, I think there are some areas, as I said earlier on, where positions are very entrenched and where it's much more difficult. And there are some arenas which are inherently much more political, where it's, again, going to be much more difficult. I think one of the problems is that everybody, the sort of evidence-based policy jargon has been taken from the medical field, which I think is unique in that it is doing, you know, hundreds of randomised controlled trials, and so things like systematic reviews are a valid mechanism to try and even randomised controlled trials are a valid mechanism to try and get credible, robust evidence of what works and what doesn't work. And they work much less well in arenas which are much less tightly defined, like sort of social services, for example. But I think the principles are valid. And what our six-step approach says is the first thing to do is to understand the context you're working in. And in some contexts, policymakers will be better convinced by rigorous research-based evidence, whereas in other contexts they will be better convinced by sort of pilot projects or simply by bringing communities together into a dialogue forum. And so the approach that you use needs to be determined by the context you're working in. But I think the fundamental principles are sound everywhere.
Thank you. So thanks again to both to Gerald and John for providing foundational conversations on integration and implementation theme of the conference. And